Is it compassionate to offer medical assisted aid in dying, or AKA assisted suicide, or even euthanasia to those who have mental illness, or even to those who are under 18, to children? Well, we're going to be discussing those topics and more on this program with Canada's former ambassador to China, Mr. David Mulroney. This man has been to the United Nations. He's lived in China. He's obviously worked with the government of Canada and has a lot of projects going on in his life. And the amount of wisdom that he imparts to the individual sitting across from him is just astounding. And I am really honored and privileged that we have the opportunity to share with you what is actually happening in Canada. And we're getting into all of it on this podcast. Welcome. Hello, hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing super well. How are you?
Doing very well. The sun is shining. It's kind of cold up here, but where are you now?
I'm in Indiana right now.
And what's the weather like?
It's actually pretty nice. Celsius, I think it's about +5 right now.
Oh, okay, because we're working on a sort of -15. So it's been really nice up until today, and it's still nice today. The sun is shining, and it's going to get warm in just a few days. But I put off my first gardening foray. I got to prune some stuff, but I'm not going to do it until the deep frost goes.
That's very fair. I to be honest, for the first 2 winters, I missed that, but now I don't miss it anymore.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah. So no, all is good. All is good. And thanks for this opportunity.
Oh, well, to be honest, thank you. I've been wanting to bring you on in some capacity, and I was so honored that you would even say yes. So for me, I feel like I'm the one who's benefiting the most from this because you have all the wisdom, and getting that to the next generation is one of my personal goals, and that's part of the reason for the podcast. So,
well, I'm going to put my glasses on. I've done a deep dive because it's a long and complicated story, and I just wanted to be sure. I won't go into a lot of stats and things like that, but there are some relevant ones, and but it's also a very depressing story. And
no kidding.
And the thing that I want to be careful about is, some of the cases are inevitably linked to stories of real human tragedy that are very sad indeed. And I want to try to talk about this without seeming that I don't care about those things, or that this isn't important. But the point, I think, is that it's not a good idea to base policy on cases like that. You need to look at what's good for the community and what are the long-term implications. And we just haven't done that in case after case after case, which is very sad. But and then I look at progressive U.S. jurisdictions like Oregon and California. Canada's blown way past them in terms of its, and so maybe we could talk a little bit about why that is. I don't have an easy answer, because I don't think it's more progressive than California. I think the answer is that California is more careful in terms of the legal structure, the legal framework that it set up, and maybe Oregon too. And California and Oregon did what Canada said it would do when assisted dying was, introduced. The judges said it's going to be very rare. It's a last resort. We're going to spend so much time on consultation and assessment and palliative care. And boom, as soon as it was out of the gate, people began dismantling that.
Right. Yeah, well, we can keep the conversation just going from there for people who maybe don't understand how far Canada has gone. I was working in the Parliament with Brad Trost when MAID, or assisted suicide, was brought in and legalized under Justin Trudeau. So maybe we can start there and show people, at least from your perspective, you're still in Canada, what is currently happening, because I don't think people really understand the gravity of the situation that's at play.
Yeah.
So what is it? Because when it first came out, everybody was saying that there was going to be structural barriers, that there was going to be precautions taken. And how long did that actually last? Do you know if it was a year or a couple months?
It was, well, so we went in 2016. By 2021, we'd introduced track 2, so your death doesn't have to be foreseen. And then from there, things began to get peeled away from the controls of final approval got waived. They began to talk about MAID for mature minors. Next year, we're supposed to introduce MAID for those whose sole condition is, or the main condition is mental illness. From the beginning, things, the regulatory and in fact legal oversight of what's been going on has been lax. So what was supposed to be a really solid assessment process can now be a phone call or a Zoom call. And we have same day request and delivery of MAID. And what I found interesting was when I tweeted the article that reported on that, and it was actually lagging when it happened, the virulence of the reaction, wow, it was one of the most, fiery blowbacks I've seen. It didn't discourage me, but and people said, you're lying. That's just not true. So there's a real disinclination to look at what's happening and to understand what's happening. And it's a little bit like, I don't know if you saw in Canada, there was a recent hidden camera exercise where they focused on late-term abortions.
No, I didn't see this.
It was reported. If you go into the National Post, you'll find it. And what was happening was one of the things they were looking at is where are places where late term is provided. And so in this case, the undercover journalist went to an abortion clinic in Toronto and said, no, we can't do them. Then pause. But that big hospital over there, which is Women's College Hospital, does do them. And then when I retweeted that, just blanket commentary, that's a lie. That's not happening. That's not true. Yeah. So there's denial plays a significant role in all of this, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, and that is something that I recently posted as well, which is interesting. You got pushback for late-term abortions happening in Canada. People are Canadians. It's not Americans. They're saying this is absolutely false, and they're outraged. Yeah. And I'm almost glad that they're outraged because people still have that understanding of this. There's still a child involved. For us, we know that no matter what stage of gestation, that is a human life and should be protected. But I'm glad that people are outraged in some capacity. Now, getting to the conversation of, I wanted to touch on, you mentioned the mature minors portion of this. That's a major, it's all an issue. It's all wrong, but there is a lot to unpack with just that. I believe it was Dying with Dignity in Canada, an organization for people who don't know. I think they were the first ones to really start advocating for this verbiage to be used. Could you unpack what it means and then some of the implications moving forward for the Canadian context, at least?
Sorry, you're talking about mature minors?
Yes, mature minors.
So that also came out of a parliamentary committee recommendation. And it fortunately hasn't been acted on, but it's certainly out there. And it has its proponents. And I was just rereading an interesting piece on Dying with Dignity. One of the problems we've faced is Dying with Dignity is probably the best funded advocacy group. It describes itself as a charity or an advocacy group, but it's a lobbyist. And when the government went to consult, they'll have like a couple of Dying with Dignity people, and the pro-life, anti-MAID people are, pared down to, they might get 20 minutes of a 3-hour session. So there's also very selective listening, and those groups have had a real strong say. I think I would say that mental illness probably has priority over mature minors, but once it gets mentioned, those things tend to happen. And Sweden, of course, has full life euthanasia. So it could happen and often the entry point is the early stages of life. And so it begins to come from both. The other thing at some point I want to talk about is just the effect. What are the words we hear around MAID? We hear choice and autonomy. Those are really important. And some of the saddest stories are from family members who find out that a close relative, a mother, for example, has been euthanized. They didn't even know this was in the cards. They don't have to consult. You don't. And so why don't we ever look at this through the prism of family or community, and what does it do? And what does it do to the medical profession? You know, some jurisdictions only have assisted suicide, which means that you get the kit and you do it yourself. Canada chose to have euthanasia too, which is, and it's by far the more popular route, I think, because people want the safety and safety. They want to use the medical system, and the problem, of course, is that it corrupts the medical system. So that's another topic if we can get to it. Because I was on the board of the 3 Catholic hospitals in Toronto. They have a combined board, and I represented the Archdiocese on that board for 4 years. I don't want to mention, if I refer to that, if you wouldn't mind, just don't ask me what those hospitals were, because I'm kind of duty bound, but I may refer to some of the things I saw and heard on that, and how right now there's a court case that I think is going to end up forcing a Catholic hospital in British Columbia to have a MAID facility on its premises. And those are the last, this has come up before, and it's, maybe we'll get lucky, but given the way the public opinion is, and what happened was a woman went to that hospital, and she was very ill. It was the only bed available in Vancouver. And then she said she wanted MAID, and she was in danger of dying, and she had to be transported, and this was seen as cruel, et cetera, et cetera. Again, a bad reason for forcing people to act against their consciences. So that's also in the works. The idea that there'll no longer be any hospitals in Canada that are allowed not to do MAID.
Oh, wow. None at all.
We're not there yet, but Catholic. So it's essentially Catholic hospitals. Catholic hospitals still play a big role in the medical system here, as they do in the States. And if they are made to, or they're required to have some kind of connection with MAID, even if it's a more remote connection, there's a building on the premises that they kind of cordon off. It begins to corrupt the system and corrode the system, and you're no longer. There are people who want to go to a hospital where they know they won't have MAID forced on them the minute they walk through the door. And they're afraid of the coercion. And I've been really deeply disappointed by how much the Canadian medical system has bought into MAID. It was thought that they'd be among the forces that kept MAID really, really rare and last resort, and they've become, to a certain extent, promoters of MAID.
Yeah, no kidding. All the way to the point where we're considering it for children and those who have mental illness. Yeah. It's mind-blowing. Well, could you speak to what you experienced when you were working in that position with the Catholic hospitals? Because this is something that I wasn't aware of.
Yeah.
What were the conversations maybe that you're having, or maybe the overarching spark notes of what was taking place, and maybe some of the combating that you had to do or others had to do to keep MAID out of those facilities? Yeah.
And that then gets down to leadership in those institutions and ensuring that leaders in Catholic healthcare understand Catholic teaching. And can I get into Catholic
Absolutely.
teaching?
Go for it.
So that leaders in Catholic healthcare understand why it's important. Not just that this is what I have to say, that they believe it and have internalized it. And without that, you begin to see people who begin to make concessions that slowly corrupt and corrode the institution and the practitioners. And in even in a big Catholic hospital, there are a lot of doctors who aren't Catholic and who may or may not be sympathetic. And I sometimes heard things that surprised me from people. And just making comments. One of them spontaneously, he said, this doctor that I knew said, we're getting a lot of, in Canada, we're getting a lot of organ transplants from MAID. And he said this in a way that seemed kind of uncritical, or it didn't seem to take in how that could be problematic. how that's another coercive element in MAID, that a person who's sick and kind of on his or her last legs and just desperate is told that, you could go through this long procedure, or you could die with MAID and your organs could go and help people. It's a kind of a positive form of coercion. And it corrupts the institution. It's what China does, right? China harvests organs. So these are all things that are just in the ether. And Canada is a leading supplier of organs from MAID now, because this year we'll reach 100,000 MAID cases performed. And this outpaces, California and Oregon. Yeah. The only jurisdiction that on a per capita basis does more MAIDs than Canada is the Netherlands. And Quebec in Canada, on a per capita basis, does more than the Netherlands. So we've shot out of the blocks and are so far ahead. So the mystery is, why Canada? Why is this happening?
Yeah, no kidding. I remember having some of those parliamentary briefings when these things were coming out and hearing that what the Netherlands, it took them about 50 years to get to the point that now Canada is at with MAID. And I was dumbfounded that there was such an expedited process, that in thinking in a parliamentary term or a legislative way, how did we get there so fast? Yeah. And now to see that you're saying 100,000 deaths, I read that in 2024 it was
this year.
Yeah. So 5.1% of all deaths in Canada were from MAID back in 2024.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that it was that fast that this had been occurring. So is it just a desperation? Is it that it's just been so widely opened that people are choosing it? Or is it just that it is coercion? I mean, it could be all of the above.
I think, one, it is the extent to which Canada has become a quote-unquote progressive society. Mm-hmm. Two, pent-up demand. It's got something like an 80% approval rating, and that's quite shocking, and it saddens me. It also has to do with the fact that Canada is a much more secular country than the United States is, and religious faith is no longer a determining, and it no longer has a significant influence on these things, although I thank God that we have strong Catholic hospitals that are among the best in the country. But once the door was open, and Quebec and British Columbia play a significant role in boosting those numbers. Quebec has about 20% of the Canadian population and 36% of its MAID. And BC, which is a progressive province, is a significant center too. There's no effort to live up to the guidelines that judges and politicians provided when it was introduced. Now that's shame on us, but that's what's happened. And there are no consequences for things that could be not just regulatory failures, but criminal failures, because the criminal code still comes in. MAID is a sort of a derogation from the criminal code of Canada, right, to allow for someone to be killed.
Right. Could you explain that for people who might not understand that fully?
Yeah. So you could do something, some forms of malpractice on MAID could be criminal offenses, because it comes from the criminal code, and that's just something that just kind of gets ignored.
I see.
Because there's been no significant follow-up on in instances where people have not followed the guidelines to the extent that they should.
That's devastating. Well, on a slight positive note, because it's a heavy conversation to have, but I know that, could you break down maybe, I know Alberta is kind of pushing back now, and a couple, maybe Saskatchewan might come into play here, and for people who don't understand, these are slightly more conservative provinces throughout the nation. How is it that provinces can actually change their guidelines on MAID, as opposed to just having the blanket national, we're going for this policy?
Well, part of it is that those provinces tend to be provinces that are obeying the original guidelines. They're saying we're not going to challenge them. And Quebec has been a leader by going ahead, and Canada being Canada, the response has been, well, I guess we have to catch up with Quebec, or we don't want this embarrassing situation where Quebec is doing things that run counter to the criminal code, or is not enforcing the law. And so it's really been that kind of a process that we're pushed ahead by the most progressive parts of Canada. And that gives politicians cover to just ease up. Nobody wants to be the enforcer on this because it would be unpopular. It would be the right thing to do, but it would be unpopular. And I mean, I'm a little disappointed. The Conservatives haven't been. They're realists, right? And if they go against that, they won't get elected. And so I don't have a happy note to end on. I think it is. I can't believe that they will go ahead with the implementation of MAID for mental illness. But there are a lot of things that have happened that I can't believe.
Okay, so on the structural part, the legislative part, there were some barriers that used to be in existence. And you've talked about California and Oregon, for example, and I know New York State also is moving in the same direction as those states. You said that Canada's blown past those specific protections in a way. What were those protections that used to be in play? And then fast forward, what are the protections now in play, if any?
That euthanasia, or what we'd call mercy killing, was still considered murder. And so this creates a category of where you could cause someone's death and not be charged under the criminal code for it. And that was a physician-assisted suicide. And so that could only be enabled by changing the criminal code. And that's still the case. And so things that you do, there are still scope for the criminal code to apply. If you're not applying the guidelines that are in that were set out for MAID, you could find yourself in jeopardy, in legal jeopardy. But that just hasn't been part of the conversation. That's not a tool that people have used to rein things in. And so things are probably happening. Things are happening that should lead to a charge under the Criminal Code of Canada.
Okay. So when MAID was first introduced, you had to have there was a different process at play than here in 2026. Yeah. So if somebody was going in initially, because it was supposed to be rare, it's supposed to be for the worst of the worst cases, you're at death's door. That used to be the case. But now you're saying that you can just have a phone call with someone?
Well, first of all, you can have it. You can have a same day assessment and have MAID come through. You can have the assessor. If the two assessors or one of the two assessors says you don't qualify, you just go and get another assessor and the doctors will help you to find an assessor. So it's not a very rigorous process whatsoever. So there's a lot of this kind of shopping. Assessments were supposed to be a lengthy. At first, they said there would be a 10 or 11 day minimum that you had to. It had to happen. You couldn't do it within 10 days. And people thought that they'd be seeking assessments. They'd be discussing palliative care options. They'd be trying different treatment options. The original idea from the justices believed that only maximum sort of 10% of cases would go to MAID, and now we're well within we're in the kind of 80 to 90% range. If you ask for MAID in Canada, chances are you're going to get it.
Wow. Yeah, I remember a conversation, a story really being broke that not just shook Canada, but shook America. I saw publications overseas putting it out about a veteran who just needed a chairlift and then being offered MAID, but that's not the only story that's come out that shocked the world. Are there other stories that I like to bring up, very personal examples of people's lives, because it's not just policy that we're talking about. It's not just a medical system, it's actual human lives and what people are going through. So are there other cases that have shaken you personally?
I listened to the testimony of a woman who had had a disability all her life, and it had constrained some things. There were some impediments, but she learned to live with it. And then once MAID was introduced, she had the experience of going to a hospital, and she didn't feel well. but the reason she was in the hospital didn't have to do with her disability, but she got a bit of a promotional pitch from one of the nurses about, why didn't she just consider maid? It's about time. And she now will not go into a hospital without someone to stand by her side and be an advocate for her. And that conversation was never supposed to be initiated by medical practitioners, but it is. And stories, there have been more stories than that about people who go in and they're offered maid as an impediment, when they as an alternative. When they introduced what's called track 2, track 1 of MAID was the first way it was put in place, and your death had to be reasonably foreseeable. So in the short term, and to the judges, they thought it would be, within a matter of days. These were people in their last moments of life.
Right.
And then people began to reinterpret it until finally it was changed to say, it's no longer needs to be reasonably foreseeable. And by the way, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the health of people with disabilities, said get rid of that provision, but they haven't. And so disabled people feel that this painted a target on them, because people then choose to see all these disabilities as another reason for MAID. And they get this they get this. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough that I think people are kind of on their guard when they go in for a consultation.
Yeah. Wow. I had no idea about that portion of track 2 switching over to that. And then I remember the UN committee coming out and stating that, and I was kind of shocked and wondering what the heck is actually happening here.
Yes.
And if they're actually paying attention, there's a lot more track that they want to go down. There's a farther agenda at play. And being a pro-life advocate, all I see here is eugenics. It just flies open the door for eugenics to just become so normalized in a society. And I know you have a lot of wisdom and understanding on that portion of just ethics around this. Could you speak to the potential of where this could go, and maybe as a cautionary tale to the rest of the world as to what you're seeing play out in the nation?
Well, I think eugenics is exactly it, that we get a form of eugenics, that people are convinced that cash-strapped healthcare systems that are overworked and overburdened need our assistance as good citizens. And since disease, some disease or disability may be arriving as we get older, we should do the decent thing for our families and for our communities and just go into this system. Now, that will sound extreme and freakish, but I think when MAID was introduced, if we talked about where we are now, people would find it extreme and freakish. And there are a lot of people who say that they're looking at MAID because they don't want to be a burden. They're also saying that they're looking at MAID because they're just not getting any kind of support for the disability they have, or they're not getting the kind of palliative care. And while we've introduced MAID, we have not significantly increased funding for palliative care or increased assistance for people with disabilities. So that, I think, is the primary concern. But down the road, it's always beware of living in a quote unquote progressive society, because once you give up on the notion that there is some fundamental, never to be transgressed rule, once you give up on the idea that human life is sacred, bad things can happen, and they happen a lot in societies where they don't believe human life is sacred. I lived in China for a while, and I could see that firsthand. So what stops this process? Well, I don't see anything right now in Canada stopping it, other than opposition from groups like the province of Alberta. International pressure, people are saying, what's happened to Canada? Canada's kind of an outlier. Canada's getting a little weird. That and just the beginnings of internal resistance. Media does not cover it significantly, other than a few papers like the National Post. The CBC is sort of pro-euthanasia and gives us happy stories, if you can believe it. So that conversation has to change. Dying with Dignity is very well funded, and has cross Canada chapters. We don't have the same kind of infrastructure to pro-life infrastructure. So it's an upward battle. It's not impossible, but it's not getting any easier as we go forward. And you don't hear reasoned arguments for respecting the sanctity of life.
And that's a pretty big missing key component to this. There's a huge conversation happening, and that element is not involved in it.
That element is just not considered relevant. And that's how you get to where you are now. I think it will be relevant. We'll see maybe growth in support for religious believers, religious communities that do believe in that, but it won't be the majority support. And the majority is now decidedly agnostic or atheist, and considers it laughable to raise those kind of concerns. And politicians are afraid to raise those concerns too, which is why we are where we are in abortion as well.
Right. And there's this old philosopher, he's a theologian rather, he's went on to be with the Lord. His name is Francis Schaeffer. And I remember him so clearly explaining that when you see an issue pop up, everything's deeply spiritual in this life, but you can see abortion, euthanasia, the whole climate cult agenda. All these things are very intricately connected and a part of the same root. And when you see everything as spiritual, you start to recognize this is the truth. So what would you say maybe to the next generation if they were wondering or pondering this kind of thought pattern of, well, euthanasia it's just compassionate? How would you course correct the next generation of Canadians into a way of thinking that actually values life and human dignity?
Well, I think it's hard to start if they don't already value life and human dignity. And so one is, I've just read Ross Douthat's book, Believe, which he's the New York Times columnist, and he wrote a wonderful book about why it makes sense to be a religious believer. And he talks about the options and the evidence, the natural evidence, the rational argument for this. So I think that might be an important part. But there's also, we talk about faith and reason. Our human reason should also tell us that this is not a good thing to do, that there's something different and special about us as human beings that needs to be protected. We still consider murder to be the most heinous crime. Suicide is still seen as a tragedy and a mistake. And we have to rediscover why we think those things. Because as you say, it goes up against this, it's sort of an anti-human pan-nature, this sort of green agenda that goes to extremes and underplays the significance of our humanity. And you can get it through reason. I think you get a better appreciation through faith, but maybe the rational argument is important too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, is there anything else on this subject? Because we've covered a lot, but if I know you're a deep thinker, you contemplate things very well and you're very articulate. Is there anything else that people really need to know on the subject of Made in Canada?
Well, the other thing I'd like, just if I get a chance to, is to talk about the extent to which euphemism is employed. So we don't have eugenics, we don't have euthanasia, we have medical assistance in dying, and we have dying with dignity, and we have autonomy and choice. And these things are again used to sell things that really are the reverse of that. So you see a policy that becomes increasingly coercive on vulnerable people, on disabled people. That's nothing about autonomy or choice. And dignity. For many of us, the most dignified death we can think of involved the execution of a man on a cross. So dignity, we cannot lose our dignity. It's God-given. If you accept that dignity is intrinsic, that you can never lose it. And you may be old and you may appear infirm, but you have the same rights and you have the same dignity that the rest of us do. And this is a theft that we should call out, that this effort to strip disabled people, and disabled people feel it acutely as an offense, that somehow they've lost their dignity because they're in a wheelchair or because they can't feed themselves the way they could. Don't let that happen. Yeah. Call the euphemism out, and continue to see the person who's of great worth.
Yeah, great worth and great value. I will say that. Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry. I was finished.
Okay. I was just going to say I feel that very personally because my grandmother, who's just gone to be with the Lord, she was witnessing all of these friends of hers, lifelong friends of hers, choose MAID, whether they were deeply ill or just older. And it is like you said, that there's this lack of palliative care being built up as an infrastructure, as an industry really in Canada to actually support these people. And there's a lack of familial just values to really come in and support those who have supported us our whole lives. Yeah. And so that is something where even my grandmother is experiencing that, and the sorrow and the sadness she was feeling and experiencing impacted me deeply and made me want to actually figure out what is actually happening, because there's a ripple effect to all these decisions being made. And I appreciate the fact that Canada has leaders like you and people who are still willing to speak out and still willing to take the backlash and still willing to fight the good fight, because that's hearts and minds at this point is what needs to be changed on top of policy. But it is hearts and minds, which
we have some real champions who are out there, and I get inspired by them. So it's not all is not lost. And this Alberta pushback is a small but welcome development. But there are some great people, Alexander Rakin and Alex Schadenberg. These are good people.
Yes, Schadenberg. I saw him in DC a month ago, and he was like, "When are you going to have me on your podcast?" And I was like, "Sir, I will have you on my podcast. I got to have Mr. Mulroney first."
No, he's fantastic.
He's great. Well, thank you for coming on, and I really thank you for what you've done in the past and what you're still doing. It is an honor.
No, thanks for this opportunity.
Absolutely.
The Bible warns about deception in the last days, but what if one of the great deceptions is what you believe or don't believe about the rapture of the church? I dive into that and much more in my latest book, They Lied to You About the Rapture.